You don't belong in this courthouse. People like you clean the floors, not walk the halls." The words cracked through the marble corridor like a gavel swung in anger. They didn't come from a judge or an attorney, but from a courthouse officer, his hands snapping up to grip her jaw as if to anchor his insult into her skin. His voice was raw authority, misused loud enough for clerks to stiffen, loud enough for jurors in waiting to turn their heads, loud enough to scorch dignity into ash. And still she didn't blink. She stood upright, her chin caught between his fingers, her breath steady. Around them, silence rippled outward. A secretary dropped her pen. A law student froze mid-step, coffee trembling in his hand. Two journalists whispered, phones already raised like witnesses in glass and steel. The officer leaned closer, spit sharp in his tone. "Stay down, B times touch. You're nothing but an impostor." That word impostor hung like smoke in the hallway, toxic, meant to choke her. For a moment, the whole building seemed to lean in, waiting for her to snap, to fight, to crumble. Instead, she breathed once. Slow, anchored. Her eyes cut through him, calm and unshaken, as if his grip were nothing but air. And then her voice, low, steady, precise, slid into the silence. "Check who I am." 4 words. No shout, no tremor, no plea. Yet they struck harder than his scream. The marble didn't just echo them. It carried them like thunder rolling down the corridor. Heads turned, mouths parted. His hand faltered for the first time, grip slackening against the quiet storm now pressing back at him. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to her. The officer's face twitched, mistaking silence for weakness. But she had heard this tone before. At 17, a mall guard who sneered that she looked out of place. At 24, a hotel clerk who said her ID didn't match the guest list. At 31, a banker who demanded proof upon proof while others breezed through with nothing but a smile. Always the same words, always the same attempt to erase her. But not today. Not in this building. Not in a courthouse whose very renovations bore her signature, whose foundation had been rebuilt with her company's name etched into stone outside. The officer's jaw clenched. "Say another word and I'll have you dragged out." She tilted her head slightly in his grip, her voice like steel whispered against glass. "You already dragged yourself out." And the whole courthouse heard it. Murmurs swelled. A law clerk dropped his folder. A journalist's phone light blinked red. The echo of her words filled the space like a verdict already passed. And just like that, the storm wasn't his anymore. It was hers. 2 hours earlier, the courthouse had looked ordinary. Sunlight spilled through tall windows, catching dust in the air, illuminating rows of benches polished by decades of anxious hands. Lawyers hurried past with folders clutched like shields. Clerks balanced stacks of documents higher than their sightline. Jurors waited in tight clusters, whispering guesses about the day's docket. To them, she was just another figure in the stream. She walked alone. No entourage, no assistant trailing behind, no flash of security detail. Just a woman carrying a leather folio, her steps deliberate but quiet. There was nothing in her appearance that screamed power, no badge of wealth, no ornament of status. And that was the point. She had been here before. Not this building, but this moment entering a space designed to measure justice, only to be measured herself. And every time, she chose the same disguise, simplicity. Let them underestimate, let them dismiss, let them reveal themselves before she revealed anything at all. The sign outside the courtroom door bore her family's name etched in brass. Few noticed. Those who did assumed it was legacy, maybe philanthropy, maybe just coincidence. No one guessed the woman quietly walking beneath it was the very architect of that name, the builder of the empire that funded half the renovations standing around them. A young clerk at the security desk had paused when she passed. "Purpose of visit?" he asked, suspicion already in his tone. She gave only her name. He tapped at a keyboard, frowned, then waved her through with a muttered, "Strange." Oh, inside, she had taken a seat on a wooden bench near the back of the hallway. She didn't pull out her phone, she didn't look around nervously. She simply waited, observing, measuring the space as much as it measured her. To onlookers, she blended into the background, another spectator, another visitor, a woman with calm eyes and an unreadable face. But beneath that stillness lived decades of preparation. She remembered 17, A mall guard who told her, "Girls like you don't shop here." She remembered 24, a hotel lobby where the clerk sneered, "Are you sure this reservation is yours?" She remembered 31, a bank teller who said, "We'll need extra verification." It's policy. Every slight, every dismissal, every gate slammed shut, it had taught her to walk through doors without needing anyone's permission. Today would be no different. Yet, as she sat in that hallway, she could already feel eyes on her. A uniformed officer near the far wall glanced her way, squinting as though trying to place her. A pair of attorneys exchanged whispers, one shaking his head, the other smirking. They saw what they wanted to see, a woman out of place. And she let them. Because what they didn't see, what they could never see, was the line already drawn between who she appeared to be and who she truly was. The moment the officer's hand would later seize her jaw, the moment his words would slice through marble and silence alike, was inevitable. It wasn't an accident. It was the system revealing itself in real time. And when it happened, she wouldn't have to prove anything. She would only have to stand. The shift began subtly, like a door closing without a sound. First, it was the glances. A bailiff standing near the double doors watched her a little too long, lips curling faintly as if the sight of her sitting there was an offense in itself. Then came the shuffle of shoes. Two more officers approached, boots heavy against the stone floor, forming a loose triangle around her bench. "Identification," one demanded, his tone sharp, already accusatory. She looked up, unhurried, and handed over the laminated pass the clerk had given her minutes earlier. The officer turned it in his hand like it was counterfeit money, his brows pulling tight. "This doesn't look right," he muttered. "Where'd you get it?" "The front desk," she answered calmly. A second officer scoffed. "Front desk doesn't issue these, not to people like you." That phrase, "people like you," slid into the air like oil on water, spreading fast, leaving no doubt what he meant. A young paralegal walking past slowed down, her eyes narrowing. A journalist at the end of the hall tilted his phone, the red light quietly blinking on. The first officer shook his head. "You must have picked it up off a table, or printed it at home. I've seen this scam before." Her gaze didn't waver. She'd heard this script too many times. The details changed, hotel keys, bank slips, boarding passes, but the subtext never did. Always the same accusation: fraud, impostor, trespasser. "I suggest you verify it," she said evenly. The officer laughed under his breath, a short, ugly sound. "Verify? You think we don't know a fake when we see one?" He turned to his colleague, who grinned, emboldened. "Maybe she's lost," the second added. "Courtrooms are that way. This section's for witnesses, attorneys, officials, not visitors." A murmur rippled down the hall. Someone whispered, "They're hassling her for nothing." Another voice answered, "Shh, you don't want trouble." The officer's smirk hardened. He leaned closer, lowering his voice, but not enough to hide it. "Here's how this works. You leave quietly, or we'll call security to escort you out. Last chance." Her silence stretched, steady as stone. She didn't rise. She didn't reach for her pass again. She simply held her ground, her composure sharpening the moment like glass under pressure. The red light on the journalist's phone glowed brighter. The paralegal's jaw tightened. A ripple of unease ran through the crowd. And then the decision was made for them. One officer reached into his radio, pressing the button with deliberate force. His voice carried across the hall. "Control, this is Unit 3. We have an unverified individual attempting unauthorized access. Possible imposter, requesting backup." The words were official, procedural, laced with the authority of the system. But everyone who heard them knew the truth. This wasn't protocol. It was prejudice, dressed in uniform. The hallway, moments ago a space of hushed routine, now hummed with tension. Papers rustled, chairs scraped, phones rose higher. A storm was forming, and she still seated. Still silent was its quiet center. The call for backup still echoed in the marble corridor when all eyes shifted back to her. The officers expected panic. They expected raised voices, flailing arms, maybe even a desperate plea. That was the script they were ready to enforce. Disorder met with force. Fear met with punishment. But she gave them none of it. She didn't rise. She didn't protest. She didn't even blink. Her posture was calm, spine straight against the wooden bench, hands folded neatly over the folio resting on her lap. She breathed as though the chaos around her didn't exist. Every inhale measured, every exhale deliberate. It was the stillness of someone who had faced storms before and learned not to chase the lightning, and the silence unsettled them more than any shout could have. One officer shifted his weight, clearing his throat like the absence of noise was pressing against him. Another tightened his grip on the radio, repeating, "Control, confirm backup en route," just to fill the void she had created. The journalist filming leaned in slightly, his lens capturing the way tension vibrated against her quiet presence. "She's not resisting," he whispered under his breath, though the red light on his phone made sure the whole world would hear it later. Across the hall, a young law intern whispered to her colleague, "Why isn't she saying anything?" The answer came not from her lips, but from the way the air itself seemed to hold its breath around her. At 17, she had shouted when a mall guard shoved her outside. At 24, she had argued when a hotel clerk denied her reservation. At 31, she had raised her voice when a bank manager froze her account. Each time, she had been met with louder voices, harsher rules, stronger walls. But years had taught her something sharper. Silence could be a weapon, not submission, not surrender, a blade invisible until it cut. So she sat, calm as stone, letting their own words pile higher like evidence in a trial they didn't realize they were already losing. "Stand up," the lead officer barked, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of her quiet. She didn't move. "Ma'am, comply," another added, louder this time, as if volume might disguise uncertainty. Still, nothing. Only the steady rise and fall of her breath, the unshaken gaze fixed not on them but on the space beyond them, as if she were already seeing past this moment, past their authority, into something larger. The murmurs in the hallway grew louder. A paralegal whispered, "They're making a scene, not her." A clerk added, "Why won't she fight back? Why isn't she afraid?" And then, quietly, from her lips only 3 words, "I will wait." Not defiance, not defeat, just patience, sharpened like stale. The words landed heavier than any scream, because in them was a promise. The storm was coming, and she wouldn't have to summon it. She only had to remain standing, or in this case, seated. Her silence was the courtroom's mirror, and in that mirror, they were already losing. The silence she carved didn't just unsettle the officers, it unsettled the crowd. At first, it was only whispers. A paralegal leaned toward her colleague, voice trembling. "She hasn't even raised her voice." The colleague nodded, glancing nervously at the officers. And yet they're the ones making it worse. The journalist's camera light burned steady, capturing every flicker of tension. He shifted his stance, speaking into his microphone softly, though the recording would later echo louder than any courtroom gavel. September 14th, County Courthouse. A woman sits quietly, accused of being an impostor. The officers? They've provided no proof, only prejudice. Behind him, a law student clutched her phone. Her thumb hovered, then pressed record. "People need to see this," she whispered, as though documenting injustice was the only way to breathe in that suffocating hall. The crowd grew bolder. A gray-haired woman in the jury pool shook her head, speaking just loud enough for others to hear. "Why are they treating her like a criminal? She's just sitting there." One of the officers barked, "Keep moving, ma'am. Nothing to see here." Oh, but there was everything to see here. The law student didn't lower her phone. The journalist didn't stop recording. Even a janitor pushing his cart near the end of the hallway paused, his eyes heavy with the kind of recognition born from years of watching the same story play out in different uniform. "Nothing to see?" he muttered under his breath. "This is the only thing to see." The pressure of witnesses changed the air. Every insult, every order, every denial from the officers was no longer trapped within marble walls. It was being logged, stored, streamed, and they knew it. The lead officer's voice cracked with irritation. "Turn those cameras off. This is official business." The journalist didn't move. "So is justice," he replied evenly. The intern filming whispered to her screen as if narrating for the future. "She hasn't resisted once. She hasn't said anything except, 'I will wait,' and they're escalating anyway. Tell me that's not bias." Her clip would later rack up thousands of views in hours, but in the moment, it was just a tremor that made the hallway hum with a new kind of electricity. For the first time, the officers looked uneasy, not because they questioned themselves, but because they realized they were no longer the only storytellers in the room. And still, she sat silent, still, deliberate. She didn't need to ask for witnesses. They had chosen themselves. She didn't need to call for evidence. It was already being collected. Her patience had become a magnet, drawing out the conscience of the crowd. Each camera raised was a mirror. Each whisper louder than the last was a reminder. The system wasn't just watching her. Now, the world was watching them. The officers shifted, visibly tense. One muttered into his radio again, but his words stumbled, no longer sharp, no longer certain. And in that hesitation, the balance in the hallway tilted. It was no longer her against authority, it was her silence against their noise, and the witnesses were deciding which side held truth. The murmurs had turned into a quiet storm. Phones lifted higher, red dots blinking like watchful eyes, and then boots echoed from the far end of the hall, heavy, deliberate, meant to silence. The crowd shifted as a taller figure pushed through, the courthouse's head of security. His uniform was pressed stiff, his badge gleaming, his jaw set in permanent disdain. Authority radiated off him, but so did arrogance. He didn't ask questions, he didn't request information, he pointed directly at her. "Remove her," he ordered, voice flat final. "She doesn't belong here." The junior officers straightened instantly, like soldiers awaiting confirmation to do what they had already wanted to. One reached for her arm. Another stepped closer, hand hovering at his belt. The journalist raised his voice for the first time. "On what grounds?" The head of security didn't even look at him. "Trespass, fraud, pick one." His eyes swept the hallway, daring anyone to challenge him. "This section is for authorized personnel only. She's not on the list." End of discussion. But it wasn't the end. She showed a pass. The paralegal near the wall spoke up, voice shaking but audible. "I saw it." The head of security turned sharply, his stare like a blade. "And I'm telling you it's fake. Sit down before you regret opening your mouth." Gasps rippled. The paralegal froze, shame flashing across her face, but the words had already landed. Witnesses knew now that proof had been ignored, discarded, erased. The black CEO didn't move. She didn't rise or argue. She let their fury grow, let their own words tangle into knots. Her silence was a mirror, and in it, their authority looked thinner by the second. The head of security stepped closer, towering over her. "You're not a lawyer. You're not staff. You're not a witness. You're nothing. You don't get to sit here like you belong." That word, nothing, cut sharper than his tone. The law student filming flinched. The journalist's camera caught every syllable. A woman in the jury pool muttered, "Unbelievable." Still, she, Saturday, calm, collected, breathing steady while his words tried to strip her down to dust. Then his voice rose, sharp enough to pierce the hush. "You will leave, or you will be dragged out like the impostor you are." The officers moved again, boots scraping against marble. One reached for her folio, tugging it toward him like evidence. It slipped, hit the floor, pages scattering. The hallway gasped, and for the first time, her head turned slowly, deliberately toward the man who had ordered it all. Her eyes met his, steady as stone, cold as verdicts. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her silence was already breaking them. The head of security sneered, misreading it as weakness. Look at her, not even denying it. Guilty people never do. But the witnesses had already seen enough. Phones recorded. Murmurs swelled. The line between accusation and abuse blurred, and in that blur, truth began to glow. The storm was almost here, and she hadn't moved an inch. The hallway had reached a fragile equilibrium, her silence on one side, their hostility on the other. But the head of security wasn't content with silence. He needed dominance, and he needed it visible. "Give me that," he barked, snatching the laminated courthouse pass from the junior officer's hand. He held it up high, letting the light catch it, like he was displaying contraband. Then, deliberately, with the sharp rip of tearing plastic, he split it in two. The sound echoed louder than his voice. Paper and laminate snapped like bones, the halves fluttering to the marble floor. Gasps filled the corridor. The paralegal's hand flew to her mouth. The law student filming whispered, "They just destroyed her pass." The journalist's camera zoomed in, catching the broken pieces on the ground. Evidence of evidence denied. The head of security dropped the scraps at her feet. "There," he said coldly. "Problem solved. No pass, no entry. Now get out." She didn't move. His jaw tightened. "You're finished here. Walk yourself out or we'll carry you out." Behind him, one of the younger officers grinned nervously, trying to mask his unease. "Should we cuff her?" he muttered. The head of security nodded. "Do it." Call city police, too. We'll charge her with trespassing and fraud. The word fraud stung the air again, laced with venom. Phones lifted higher. The witnesses were no longer just curious, they were outraged. "This is harassment," someone muttered loudly. "She had proof, I saw it," another added. "They tore it up, on camera," shouted the law student, her voice cracking with anger. The head of security whipped around. "Silence! All of you!" His barked command bounced off marble, but it didn't work. Not this time. Because the silence he demanded already belonged to her. The officer nearest to her stepped forward, cuffs glinting in his hand. He reached down, fingers brushing her wrist. The crowd collectively gasped, and that was when she finally moved, not to struggle, not to lash out, but to pull her hand gently back into her lap. The smallest motion, yet charged with more defiance than any shout could hold. Her voice was quiet, almost tender, yet every syllable landed like iron. "You'll regret this." The officer froze mid-reach. The head of security snarled, mistaking calm for weakness. "Regret? You think you can threaten us? You're nothing here." He gestured sharply toward the doors. "Get her out, now, before the judge sees this embarrassment." But the judge wasn't the one watching. The hallway was. The cameras were. The world beyond the red recording lights was. And with every insult, every tear of paper, every order to erase her, the courthouse was writing its own indictment, one they didn't realize was already on trial. The shredded badge still lay on the marble floor like an accusation no one could deny. The crowd stared at the pieces. The officers stared at her, but she only lowered her gaze once, just long enough to mark the evidence of their arrogance, and then lifted it back up, steady as stone. Her hand moved slowly, deliberately, into her folio. Fingers brushed over papers, then found what she really sought. Her phone. The head of security sneered. "What now? Calling your lawyer? Go ahead, waste your dime." She didn't answer him. Instead, she unlocked the screen with a single swipe, pressed one button, and lifted the device to her ear. On the second ring, a crisp voice came through. "This is Thompson." Her own voice was barely above a whisper, yet carried through the tense silence like a bell. "It's happening. Begin protocol." Every phone in the hallway kept recording. The journalist zoomed in, the red light unwavering. A woman in the jury pool mouthed, "Protocol?" The head of security frowned. "Who do you think you're talking to? You think a call will stop this?" But his words already sounded thinner, smaller, like they were competing with something larger rising beneath them. From the phone came Thompson's reply, firm and immediate. "Confirmed. Timestamp logged. Systems engaging." The paralegal gasped. The law student whispered into her own recording, "She's prepared. She's been prepared for this exact moment." The officer with the cuffs hesitated, looking at his superior. "Sir, what's she doing?" "She's stalling," the head of security snapped. But his tone carried less certainty now. The black CEO's eyes lifted, locking with his. For the first time since they'd surrounded her, she spoke more than a sentence. "You believe you hold power because of this uniform, because of these halls. But you don't understand your authority exists inside a system, and I built that system." The words landed like a verdict. The crowd erupted in whispers. The journalist's microphone caught every syllable. Replay ready. Her phone chimed once. A message on the screen lit up. Thompson again. Audit live. Backup secured. All feeds sync. She let the glow fade before lowering the device to her lap, her expression unreadable. Then, almost gently, she said, "Every second has been recorded. Every word has been logged. You haven't exposed me, you've exposed yourselves." The head of security's face flushed red, but his jaw clenched shut. For the first time, he didn't bark another order. Around them, the hallway shifted. No longer tense with expectation, but heavy with the dawning realization that something irreversible had just begun. And she hadn't raised her voice once. The phone in her lap dimmed, its screen fading back to black. But the silence it left behind was electric, as if the entire courthouse were holding its breath. She lifted her chin, her eyes fixed on the head of security. Calm, certain, the kind of certainty that didn't ask for permission, it declared. "You keep calling me an impostor," she said, her voice low, deliberate, each word slicing clean through the noise. "But the truth is simpler. You're standing in a courthouse that I own." The sentence landed like a hammer. At first, no one moved. Then gasps spread through the hallway like ripples across still water. A paralegal clutched her chest. The law student whispered, "What did she just say?" The journalist's camera shook for a moment, then steadied again, framing her face like history itself. The head of security barked a laugh, harsh and brittle. "Own? You? Don't make me laugh. This courthouse belongs to the county, to the state." Her gaze didn't waver. "And whose name is etched in brass on the cornerstone outside?" The words pulled his head back slightly, like a punch he hadn't seen coming. He opened his mouth, but found nothing to say. The paralegal spoke louder now, to no one and everyone at once. "It's true. I saw it when I walked in. The plaque outside it says, Carter Foundation. She's Carter." Murmurs exploded. Phones shifted angles, capturing both the plaque on the wall and her steady figure on the bench. A woman in the jury pool whispered to her neighbor, "She built this place. They're throwing out the person who built it." Ugh. Her voice cut through again, calm but sharp. "I didn't just donate. I financed the reconstruction. My company oversees the contracts, the maintenance, the security clearances. Every paycheck signed here passes through my approval." The officers froze. The one holding the cuffs lowered his hands, eyes darting nervously. The others stepped back half a pace without realizing it. The head of security's face drained of color. "That's impossible." Ugh. Her lips curved faintly, not in humor, not in pity, just certainty. "You mistook silence for submission. That was your last mistake." The crowd's energy flipped in an instant. No longer whispers of doubt, but cheers of recognition. A law student raised her phone higher. "She's the CEO. She's the one who—" Her words dissolved into the swell of voices, people narrating, exclaiming, recording, sending proof into the digital world beyond those marble walls. The journalist's microphone caught it all, but his eyes told the real story wide, alive, stunned. The black CEO finally stood, smooth and unhurried, her presence filling the hallway without needing to raise her volume. "I walked in here quietly," she said, her gaze sweeping the stunned officers. "But you insisted on making noise. Now everyone knows exactly who I am and who you are." The head of security opened his mouth again, but no sound came. The crowd had already drowned him out, and for the first time since the confrontation began, the power in the hallway shifted entirely. It was no longer theirs. It was hers. For a long moment, the only sound in the corridor was the faint buzz of phone cameras recording. Then the tension broke like glass shattering. The officer holding the cuffs stumbled back a step, eyes darting between the shredded badge on the floor and the calm woman now standing before him. His grip loosened, metal clinking against marble as the cuffs slipped in his hand. One of the junior officers whispered urgently to his colleague, She's the one who signs our contracts." The other swallowed hard, muttering back, "If that's true, we're finished." The head of security, still rooted in place, had gone pale. His voice, once booming with authority, cracked when he finally spoke. "This is a stunt. She's bluffing." But the words didn't land. They sounded brittle, empty like a gavel swung in the wrong courtroom. The crowd erupted. The paralegal who had spoken earlier now stood taller, no longer whispering. "I saw her name in the system. She's telling the truth." The law student pointed her phone directly at the head of security. "You tore up her pass. You tried to throw her out of her own courthouse. And we all have the footage." Applause burst out suddenly, raw and unplanned. A gray-haired juror clapped her hands together sharply. A young man in a suit whistled. Even the janitor leaned against his cart, nodding slowly, a small smile cutting through years of silence. The journalist narrated into his microphone, his voice trembling with the urgency of history. What began as harassment has turned into revelation. The woman they called an impostor is the benefactor, the CEO behind this courthouse's foundation. And now, every insult is evidence, every action caught on tape. Phones lifted higher. Live streams ticked upward as viewers joined by the hundreds, then thousands. Comments began scrolling across screens, disbelief and outrage mixing with awe. The officers felt it, the walls closing in not from her, but from everyone around them. Every bystander had become a witness. Every witness had become a jury. The junior clerk who had issued her badge earlier peeked around the corner, his face stricken. I logged her name this morning. She was cleared." His confession carried across the hall like a verdict. The head of security turned on him, fury desperate to find a target. "Shut your mouth before you lose your job." But the black CEO spoke first, her voice calm yet final. "He's not the one who should worry about his job. Gasps again. The head of security's lips pressed into a tight line, but his hands trembled at his sides. The atmosphere flipped completely. Minutes ago, she had been surrounded, isolated. Now it was the officers who stood alone, the crowd forming a loose semicircle around her, not to contain, but to shield. A woman in the jury pool declared loudly, "We're not leaving until this is addressed, until she's respected." Others nodded, voices overlapping in agreement. The head of security opened his mouth again, but the sound of clapping drowned him out. The applause wasn't coordinated, but it spread, swelling until the marble walls themselves seemed to vibrate with it. The officers looked smaller now, shrunken by the weight of eyes, phones, and truth pressing against them. And in the center of it all, the black CEO remained perfectly still, silent, composed, letting the storm consume them instead. The applause faded into a tense, electric silence, the kind that waits for judgment to fall. Every camera stayed trained on her. Every witness leaned forward, waiting. The officers still hovered, uncertain, their earlier bravado stripped bare. She raised her phone again. No rush, no anger, just precision. One swipe, one tap, and her assistant's voice filled the quiet. "Miss Carter, systems are standing by." Her gaze never left the head of security. "Terminate the contract with Courthouse Security Division effective immediately. Suspend all access credentials tied to their staff." A pause on the line, then, "Confirmed. Executing now." The head of security laughed, brittle and strained. "You don't have that authority." But his words were swallowed by the sharp beep of his radio. The device in his hand blinked red, then died. He tapped it twice, 3 times. Nothing. Another officer fumbled with his badge at the checkpoint scanner. The machine flashed red. Denied. He tried again. Faster this time. The same result. The journalist's camera zoomed in, catching every frantic motion, every confirmation that power had just shifted hands. Her voice was steady, clear. "As of this moment, none of you represent this courthouse. You represent only your choices, and you will answer for them." One officer stammered, You can't do this." But a second later, his phone buzzed. He looked down, pale. "Employment status, terminated, access revoked." The notification glared back at him, final and unarguable. The crowd erupted again, not in chaos, but in satisfaction. The paralegal whispered, "She just fired them. Right here." The law student muttered, "I've never seen justice happen so fast." The head of security's face turned crimson. He lunged forward a step, but 2 jurors instinctively shifted between him and her, blocking his path. He froze, suddenly smaller than the crowd surrounding him. She lowered her phone, speaking not to him alone, but to everyone gathered. "I don't need to shout. I don't need to argue. Justice doesn't always wait for a courtroom. Sometimes it happens in the hallway." The janitor nodded, eyes shining. The journalist whispered into his mic, "History. We are watching history." The head of security clenched his fists, trembling. "This isn't over." She met his stare, unwavering. "It's over for you." And with that, the hallway seemed to exhale. Officers who once loomed over her now stood stripped of their authority. The witnesses who once whispered now applauded openly. The scales had tipped, and there was no tipping them back. Her silence had begun the battle. Her authority had ended it. The marble hallway, moments ago thick with hostility, now pulsed with something else entirely, vindication. The red recording lights burned steady. The applause, once scattered, rolled into waves. The very walls seemed to lean in, waiting for the final word. She stood in the center of it all, calm, anchored, not triumphant, not gloating, simply present, as though justice itself had chosen to wear her face. The head of security had slumped back against the wall, badge useless, radio dead. The officers beside him shifted uneasily, no longer guardians of order but remnants of a failed performance. Their silence was louder than their earlier shouts. She took one slow breath, then lifted her chin, her voice carrying without effort. "You tried to erase me with words. You tried to diminish me with force. You thought silence meant weakness." Her gaze swept the hall, meeting the eyes of jurors, clerks, interns, journalists, each of them witnesses, each of them complicit now in the truth. But silence is not weakness, it's patience, and patience always reveals the truth. Ugh. The law student lowered her phone just slightly, whispering, "She's not talking to them anymore, she's talking to us." She stepped forward, past the torn badge on the floor, past the officers who had called her nothing, past the crowd that now parted for her like water. Every step echoed like a verdict, deliberate and final. At the doors, she paused. The hallway held its breath again. She turned back, not with rage, not with vengeance, but with the steady weight of someone who carried too many scars to waste energy on shouting. Her final words cut through the charged air. "I don't need to prove myself on camera. I am the result of every camera you ever ignored. And today, you recorded your own downfall." Gasps, then silence. The kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but whole thick with realization, with change, with the certainty that nothing in that courthouse would ever feel the same again. The journalist lowered his microphone slowly, whispering into it like a prayer. She didn't just defend herself. She rewrote the script. Behind her, the applause returned, this time thunderous, unstoppable. People clapped not just for her, but for the idea she embodied. Dignity without compromise, justice without begging, power revealed without ever raising her voice. She opened the courthouse doors and stepped into the light, her figure framed against the brass plaque outside bearing her name. The cameras followed, but she no longer needed them, because the moment was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told you don't belong here. And as the doors closed behind her, the message lingered like a verdict carved into stone. Justice doesn't always need a gavel. Sometimes, it only needs the courage to stand still.